There have been a lot of mixed emotions at Afghanistan falling to the Taliban. Finally, after 20 years of fighting them, after ousting their government in 2001, the Taliban are now back and in pretty much total control of the main territories in Afghanistan after the US withdrew their forces and the army of Afghanistan quickly collapsed, surrendered. Various things, coming into play of that: corruption, soldiers not actually being paid. The president of Afghanistan fled with over $100 million, and that pretty much sums up, the occupation of Afghanistan by the US. But today, what I want to talk about is the reaction, and weirdly, the patriotic American conservatives who start praising the Taliban. This force that the US have been fighting for years, which have inflicted lots of casualties on the US army, not to mention the stuff they've done to innocent Afghan civilians as well. But now the right wing praise him, and this gets into my whole theory, is that the right wing will just praise anyone who's against the libs. You saw like Ben Shapiro and Charlie Kirk defending the Queen against Meghan Markle. Totally bizarre for so-called patriots. And now you see this stuff with the Taliban, which is probably not surprising. And I want to double up in this video. I also want to talk about liberals and using women's rights to justify Western colonialism, specifically in Afghanistan, and basically talk about that if the US, if the UK ever cared about women's rights in Afghanistan, probably shouldn't have helped overthrow the communist government there that started in the 70s. And even after that, you probably should have helped the women's rights movements in Afghanistan protesting the Taliban, instead of invading, which they didn't want you to do, and they criticised you throughout. I'm going to plug my social media and Patreon for about a minute, so skip that stuff if you're not interested. But before we get any further, a lot of my work on this channel is demonetized because when you're covering more serious, sometimes edgier topics, YouTube doesn't like this. So if you've ever enjoyed my work, please consider becoming a patron. And you don't have to pledge a crazy amount. I want to build up my Patreon based on as many people as possible, pledging little amounts like $1 or $2. So if you feel like I have ever brought anything that's worthwhile into your life and my content, please really consider becoming a patron to help me continue to do this, regardless of if YouTube monetize or not most of my videos in a given month. Also, if you want to join our communities, come check out our Discord and my subreddit. Those links in the description. And if you want to follow me personally, please check out the Kavernacle at Twitter, at Instagram, and also my personal Reddit, where you can keep up to date with all my content and what I'm doing. For every 5k, we get a new chocolate orange. The pyramid is steadily growing. I want to hit about 45 by the end of the year, so I guess that's one more chocolate orange, maybe push to 50, so help me with that goal. I also live stream 2 times a week, and I archive those streams on the Kavernacle Extra, my second YouTube channel, so go check that out. So a whole assortment of weird right-wing grifters all started praising the Taliban in the wake of their victory over the Afghan army. I say victory, but there barely even was much resistance to them. So Paul Joseph Watson, low-key bigging up the Taliban, he retweeted, "Walk past Afghan boys dramatically retelling the story of looters taken down by locals in the Taliban. Everywhere you go, people are excitedly talking about how criminals who had been freely terrorizing Kabul for months are finally getting the punishments they deserve." Liam McCullum tweeted a snippet of the Taliban leaders talking about freedom of speech and Facebook, who claim to promote it while still censoring it.
This question should be asked to those people who are claiming to be promoters of freedom of speech, who do not allow publication of all information. I can ask Facebook company. This question should be asked to them.
And then a lot of right-wingers like the Taliban saying this stuff, so Candace Owens being one of them. We've reached the next level when the Taliban is hitting at the totalitarianism of the US. And yes, they are telling the truth here. Big tech in collusion with the Democrats have destroyed the elements that gave America the moral high ground in discussions about freedom worldwide. Someone replying, "That moment when the Taliban makes more sense than the US president, surreal. The quartering, Taliban more pro-First Amendment than the US government. Just another embarrassment." And underneath this tweet, Taliban is based. I don't know how little knowledge you have to know of just the world to even think the Taliban are more First Amendment than the United States. Now, I don't like the United States. I think it's one of the most destructive countries in the entire planet. But in terms of freedom of speech laws, and of course, I don't believe the First Amendment is as strong as people make out to be, but you cannot compare the laws on free speech in America compared to the laws on free speech in the previous regime in Afghanistan ruled by the Taliban, and probably in the coming regime. It's not comparable. I don't even know why people say stuff like this. It's ridiculous. Nick Fuentes saying, the Taliban is going to ban abortion, vaccines and gay marriage. Maybe we've been fighting on the wrong side for 20 years. I just want to talk about this point for a second. Most people don't realise most extremist groups are conservative. They are far right. So these guys often have a lot in common with each other, especially people on the far right like Nick Fuentes, because in a lot of ways, despite them absolutely hating each other, because they're Christian fundamentalists versus Islamic fundamentalists, they do at their core agree with a lot of things because they are right-wing, and right-wingers across the world share a lot of values, and that normally is upholding the status quo, but also upholding a more conservative, social policy, and that's stuff these guys always agree on, and that's why it makes me laugh a lot of the time when people who love to fearmonger about Islam the most are often people who probably would agree with the fundamentalists in that religion a lot more than they would care to admit. Donald Trump Jr. also commented on the Taliban criticising the freedom of speech in the US, saying, "Lol, also not wrong," and then he also talks about a picture saying, "I can't help but notice that no one is wearing a mask and there's truly a troubling lack of diversity in this photo." Now, someone else called Robert J. O'Neill said, "Did you see how the Taliban rolled through the streets and took back their country? I know a few dudes who would do the same with me right now." So isn't that lovely? American conservatives want to emulate the Taliban in their own country. So patriotic that you want to overthrow the government. Lauren Boebert saying, the Taliban are the only people building back better. And this is someone who's a congresswoman in the United States. So you're saying the Taliban are making their country better? So you support the Taliban, patriotic conservative? Someone who says they're one of the most patriotic conservatives? Again, it is just totally ridiculous, their logic. And then here's another one. Mr. James at Mr. Veracity tweeted a big long thread. So, Taliban X, America, tick. Gay marriage. Taliban doesn't support it, America does. Gender transitions. Taliban doesn't support it, America does. Gender studies. Taliban doesn't support it, America does. Women in the military. Taliban doesn't support it, America does. Pride Month. Taliban are against it, America's for it. Women voting. Taliban are against it, America's for it. Looters and thieves, Taliban are against it, America's for it. Critical race theory, Taliban are against it and America are for it. Kneeling during national recognition, Taliban are against that, America are for it. Men in girls' bathrooms, Taliban are against that, America are for it. And toxic masculinity, Taliban are against it and America is for it. So what these far-right American conservatives are basically saying is they prefer the Taliban to the United States. So this guy is outlining a lot of conservative positions. I'm not sure how many conservatives don't want women voting anymore, although I'd assume it's probably quite high, probably surprisingly high. But a lot of these things are basically praising the Taliban for having conservative social values. So these guys prefer the Taliban to America. Again, these guys seemingly have some sort of brain rot where they've convinced themselves that they are the most patriotic Americans, while also supporting the Taliban, wanting to emulate them, and praising the Taliban. Sheep in the Box, who is a left-wing YouTuber, you guys should go check him out. He sent me TERFS praising the Taliban, so people who are anti-trans rights, basically. So he sent me some screenshots, I want to read you of them. So someone saying, the Taliban know exactly what a woman is without having to ask for their preferred pronouns. Why do you think that is? Someone else saying, Taliban know what a woman is. Left-wing men, women are so indefinable. If it's anything, it's a quality of wanting subservience to be sexually abused, such a turn-on. If you don't see the obscenity of it now, I don't know what will make you see. Another one, Afghanistan Taliban, females can only leave the home with a male escort. Western Taliban, you can only leave the home if there are males in the female toilets and hospital wards you see. So, totally insane logic that you're comparing basically left-wing people who are for trans rights like the Taliban, but but also praising the Taliban for being socially conservative. If you are allying with the Taliban on anything and praising them and upholding them as some sort of bastion of social values, you might want to get your head checked, basically, because your critical thinking, your general logic, and your general reasoning is just not working here. But I think that goes to show you guys, and I've been saying it for a long time, the overturned window is so to the right in America that a lot of self-described conservatives and patriots and everything, they actually subscribe to a far-right ideology. And it's not really surprising that while they might hate Islam, they don't hate the social values of groups like the Taliban necessarily, and they actually probably would agree with them on a lot of things, especially compared to left-wing people in the United States as well. So we've talked about conservatives and the far right and how ridiculous their view on the Taliban is. Now I want to shift this to liberals and even some leftists who think using feminism, women's rights, is something they should do to excuse colonialism, right? So even if you don't necessarily agree about why people went into Afghanistan in terms of like why the occupation had to continue past the Taliban government being overthrown, a lot of people will say, well, we helped women's rights. We made women's lives better, and we're so benevolent in the West. Just go into another country, toppling their government, imposing a new stooge government composed of loads of brutal warlords, and giving them freedom and women's rights. And I want to talk about like the history of Western colonialists doing this. And I want to also discuss how in a vacuum, doing something good is not always the best way to go about achieving equal rights, because things don't exist in a vacuum. A group of outsiders coming to another country and imposing a government and a set of laws on people is never going to help organically grow the move for equality in those countries. So Alistair Campbell, King Lib, and one of the architects of the Iraq War, quote tweeted Zara Sultana, who is one of the best young MPs in Britain at the moment, said, "It's interesting that some of the people demanding we now protect women's rights are the same people who failed to acknowledge that those rights were won by the military intervention against the Taliban 20 years ago." Sarah quote tweeted him, he deleted it, "If I had been instrumental in taking Britain into a legal war that killed more than 1 million people, I'd keep my mouth shut." And I replied underneath, "Saving women has been used to justify British colonialism since the 1700s. If they cared about it first, they wouldn't have armed the Islamists fighting the communist government." This is in the 1970s and 80s. "Second, they would have funded the RAWA women's movement that protested the Taliban government." And we're going to talk about all of this. So let's just go to Wikipedia and get a really basic summation of Communist Afghanistan and women's rights there. So communist era of women's rights. So the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan and the Republic of Afghanistan, which followed the revolution of 1978 that toppled the government of Mohammed Daoud Khan, was a period of unprecedented equality for women in Afghanistan. The communist ideology officially advocated gender equality and women's rights, and the communist government sought to implement it on all classes throughout both urban and rural Afghanistan. The government, led by Nur Mohammad Taraki, gave equal rights to women in 1978. This gave them the theoretical ability to choose their husbands and careers. The Afghan Women's Council was funded as an organisation to defend and implement these rights. Until 1989, the AWC was led by Masuma Esmati Wardak and run by a staff of 8 women. The AWC had around 150,000 members and offices in nearly all the provinces, and it provided social services to women in Afghanistan in the fight against illiteracy and providing vocational training in the sectorial, hairdressing and manufacturing fields. During the communist era, women's rights were supported by both the Afghan government and later the Soviets who intervened there. In contrast to what had been the case during the monarchy, when women's rights had mainly been restricted to urban elites, the communists attempted to implement gender equality and women's rights to all classes of society, even rural women and girls. The policy of unveiling and compulsory schooling for girls as well as boys was, however, met with a strong backlash from the conservative rural population and contributed to the resistance against the Soviets and the communist regime. The AWC came to symbolise women's rights in the eyes of many who feared the sacrificing of the AWC in the National Reconciliation Talks in 1987. It is claimed that in 1991, around 7,000 women were in the institution of higher education and around 230,000 girls studying in schools around Afghanistan. There are around 190 female professors and 22,000 female teachers. Look, there are plenty of things you can criticize the communist government of Afghanistan. There are plenty of ways you can criticize the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, including the way they conducted the war, which was very, very brutal in certain instances. But what you can't deny is this communist government gave women more rights. That is indisputable. And if Western countries cared about women as much as they pretend they do right now, before the invasion in 2001, or whenever, then they would not have funded some of the most radical Islamists in the area to fight the Soviet Union and to fight the communist government in Afghanistan. Again, if you love women's rights, why don't you let the communists implement their programs to help spread women's rights around the country? And of course, it was part of his backlash in Afghanistan, where conservative rural areas, which also would make the bedrock of the support for the Taliban later on, it's not surprising there was this massive backlash in a society that does have very conservative elements, very religious elements as well, but it's clear they definitely made progress on this stuff. Now, what makes it even more ironic is that when the West invaded in 2001, they used feminism as a justification of that, not recognizing that 9 years prior, a government fell which literally made women's lives better in Afghanistan. So I wrote this for my master's in a piece about Edward Said, Orientalism, and the representation of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq in Western film. So to give you some context of how, liberals and conservatives in America and the West justified the invasion in 2001, First Lady Laura Bush spoke in a radio address in November 2001 that fueled this discourse. She spoke of the malnourishment and poverty of Afghan women due to their oppression at the hands of the Taliban. Lumping in the Taliban with Islam helped make the fight against female oppression seem more like a divide between the civilized people of the world and Islamic countries, not the US and the Taliban, which did not help to deter stereotypes about Islam in general. Laura Bush also helped perpetuate the old language of Orientalism in saving women of colour from the barbaric practices of the East. After the invasion, Laura Bush said the Afghan women were no longer imprisoned in their homes and they can listen to music and teach their daughters without fear of reprisals by the Taliban. The media also helped frame the Bush administration's narrative. Pictures of Afghan women in burqas and niqabs appeared with reports of their subjugation on the covers of Newsweek and the New York Times. After the invasion, the media ran stories about how the intervention had finally allowed women to not wear a burqa. The burqa became a symbol of oppression around the world, not just in Afghanistan. The power of the Bush administration and the US media helped frame the helplessness of Afghan women, but far less coverage was given to women's rights movements within the country. The Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan had been constantly struggling for equal rights before the invasion. Now, the Bush administration briefly courted this women's rights movement, but basically discarded them because they wanted funding for themselves, not for the US to come and start this war. Now, I just want to talk about them a bit more because they've also been extremely critical of the US and NATO action in Afghanistan. So RAWA is highly critical of the NATO intervention that began in 2001 because of the high rate of civilian casualties. The organization went so far as to threaten to sue the US government for unauthorized use of 4 photos from their websites that was used in propaganda. After the defeat of the Taliban government, they warned that the NATO-allied Afghan forces were just as fundamentalist and dangerous as the Taliban. They charged that the government led by Karzai lacked support in most areas of Afghanistan and the fundamentalists are enforcing laws unfairly, treating women as they were under the Taliban. These claims are supported by media reports about the Herat government of Ismail Khan, who had created a committee for the propagation of virtue and prevention of vice that forced women to obey strict dress and behaviour codes, as well as many reports by Human Rights Watch. One report released by Human Rights Watch in 2012 described a situation where women are punished by the judicial system for attempting to escape from domestic abuse. It says that Karzai is unwilling or unable to take a consistent line against conservative forces within the country, and the lack of improvement in the plight of women in Afghanistan after 10 years is shocking. So in that context, the US and the West have never cared about women's rights in Afghanistan. And to even trot that out after the fall of Afghanistan lately is just totally ridiculous. Like I said, go all the way back to the communist government there. Why did you help very conservative Islamist forces fight that government? And of course, what happened to these mujahideen? they would split, and a lot of them would become the warlords, who would become the government after the 2001 invasion, and a lot of them would form the Taliban. So essentially, they helped arm and train people who would become both sides of this conflict, but of course, both sides who did not care about women's rights. Now, the history of using women's rights and saving women from the barbary of the East, of the Orient, has long been established in Western colonialism. Now, just like within Afghanistan, you can say in like Kabul, for example, and because of the Western intervention and the overthrow of the Taliban, that in a vacuum, women there going to school and not having to cover up and getting more access to jobs and stuff, that's good in a vacuum. But just like these women's rights movements say in Afghanistan, is like basically the people you're empowering in the first place don't care about this stuff. But also this is a foreign power doing this. So it really, really hurts the cause because it's not happening organically. Now I want to use another case study of something in history to really illustrate my point a bit further. So bear with me with this one. In India, there was something called sati. Basically, when a man died, in certain cultures throughout India, the women would be put on the funeral pyre alive. You see this in things like Viking culture as well. It's not exclusive to India. But basically, when the East India Company was taking over India, and this is before formal control by the British government, a Governor General called Lord William Bentinck banned sati on December 4th, 1829. Of course, it had a similar impact to the Afghanistan stuff because there were lots of people in India at the time who wanted to ban it, even going as far back as hundreds of years before. And rather than empowering the reformers, the British just went in and banned it themselves. And of course, that created the backlash of a foreign power from thousands of miles away coming to a country and enacting its own laws on the people and not helping something organically grow, which if it grows organically, then it will take root further. Think of the West struggles for, anti-racism laws and anti-sexism laws. Imagine if like another country had come in and made that law. Would it have been as effective in promoting that in society? You guys know the answer, that it definitely would have not. If Russia invaded the US and said, there you go, equal rights for women from communism, do you think that would have gone over well? Probably not. So it's always better to empower local people to do this reform themselves, who understand the culture, who understand the history. Don't just go in there as a white saviour and obviously take over the country by military force in most of these cases, and then enact these laws, which then create a massive backlash to them. So it says in the 16th century, Humayun was the first to try and get a royal agreement against the practice. Akbar, the Mughal emperor, was the next to issue official orders prohibiting sati. He also issued orders that no women could commit sati without a specific permission from his chief police officers. Akbar also instructed the officers to delay the woman's decision for as long as possible. But even at the time, the English knew, and from victorianweb.org it says that a more acceptable concern was to not upset relationships with the populace. Indian and English historians alike agree that there was a real anxiety that heavy-handed measures would offend Indian sensibilities, and particularly a fear of Hindus and Muslims perceiving British rule as a threat to their religions. The danger had long been recognised. So talking about the reaction back in Britain, and this article goes on to say, the issue clearly caught the public imagination. The plight of beautiful and exotic women made a greater impact than, say, that of even more helpless victims. No doubt it brought out the knight-errant spirit, graphically reinforcing a sense of mission, a belief in spiritual, moral and cultural superiority that handily justified the colonization of a distant land. So they use this whole issue to paint India as some sort of backwater, a really barbaric, savage society, which the British had to come in and reform, bring British, Western, Anglo-Saxon values that were so enlightened to this country and save these women. And another article from lairviewofbooks.org, which I found like a nice little paragraph here talking about this stuff. Before the British occupation, India was not a poor backwater, but a culturally and economically prosperous civilization that had existed for millennia. India was home to the oldest university in the world, had originated our numerical system, had produced countless thinkers, philosophers, poets, and scientists. It had given the world Buddhism and Hinduism. It had birthed a more tolerant, pluralistic version of Islam. Yoga and meditation, so common among the overworked professional classes in the West, were born in India thousands of years before there was even a West to speak of. In the 17th century, Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb took in 10 times the revenue of his contemporary Louis XIV of France. According to the economist Angus Mannison, in the 18th century, India accounted for 23% of the world's GDP, a percentage greater than all of Europe combined. By the time the British packed up their things and sailed home in 1947, that number had fallen to under 3%. I like that last little statistic to show how much Britain looted India. But this is something the West has constantly done, and it's not just India and Afghanistan that, of course, are very close to each other. But you can see what they did there. They took an issue like sati, which wasn't done all throughout India, which had various different rulers of India try and outlaw, had reformist people in India trying to outlaw as well. But the British came in and said, you guys are barbarians, we need to control you, so we are outlawing this. And of course, many Indians thought they would do that further. And it's just how the West takes the Taliban and say, look at Afghanistan, how backwards, how could these guys be in charge? How could they win the civil war? How could they still exist in the government? How could people still support them even after, 2001? Well, we've got to go in there. We've got to impose Western values on them. These guys cannot be trusted to do it themselves. We won't empower women's movements in the country. We just have to come in and do it. And a lot of you guys are younger and maybe you haven't read up on this, but the plan of the Bush administration before the invasion of Iraq was to invade Iraq, Iran, Libya, Syria and North Korea, topple these dictatorships and put in Western-backed governments. And this neoconservative ideology of spreading American Western values through force is something that top people in the Bush administration really wanted to do. And if Iraq went better, who knows what their next target would be. This was called, of course, you guys would have heard this, the axis of evil, where loads of random countries who the US didn't like were thrown in together like they were the Axis from World War II or something. But that is something to keep in mind. Let me finish this off by saying, of course, you can feel immense sadness for the women in Afghanistan under Taliban rule, because I do. And the reprisals a lot of them will face, and a lot of the freedoms a lot of them will get taken away from them. And you can feel awful about the situation and the Taliban taking over, but I would urge caution in engaging in this sort of rhetoric about how the West needs to be there, needs to impose their own system on Afghanistan, their culturally superior system, while not actually helping the reformers in Afghanistan itself. Because the RAWA never liked the occupation. They're one of the biggest women's organisations in Afghanistan. Of course, I'm talking about the communists before. That was a massive movement in Afghanistan. But the West never cared about it then. They only care about it when it's convenient. And there's a school of thought in international relations theory, which I, of course, did my master's in, which basically is countries like the US, empires in general, will use the language of, I guess, progressive social change and enlightened values to justify imperialism and justify their actions. And they are rarely sincere, if not never sincere. It's just a smokescreen for power and imperialism. And that's what the US and UK have always done. So please do not be duped by this. And of course, there's going to be a lot of suffering in Afghanistan. I just hope we don't alienate them even further by making them some sort of pariah, because it's clear the Taliban aren't going away. If you're going to deal with Saudi Arabia, who subscribe to a very similar ideology, you can deal with the Taliban, because throwing things like sanctions and brutal restrictions on them is not going to hurt the leadership of the Taliban. It's going to hurt the poorest people in Afghanistan, just as it did with Saddam Hussein's Iraq after the Gulf War, just as it does in Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, North Korea. There is no point doing this stuff when you accept people in the community and prop them up like Saudi Arabia and Israel, who do things that are just as bad. So anyway, that is my Afghanistan video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you want to support the channel, please check out my Patreon. If you want to find me on social media, at the Kavernacle on Twitter and Instagram. Come join our communities on my Discord and my subreddit. And if you made it this far, thank you all for watching.